There are people who move through this world quietly, carrying their lives like a private thing, and then there are people whose very existence becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting something raw and unresolved that the rest of us can't quite look away from. Annie Guthrie is one of those people. She didn't arrive in the public eye the way most do. There was no carefully engineered entrance, no publicist scripting her image from the ground up, no studio machine amplifying her name before she'd even had the chance to earn it. What she brought instead was something that no amount of industry connections or strategic positioning can manufacture. She brought a quality of realness and authenticity so unguarded and so immediate that people felt it the moment they encountered her. Not after careful consideration, not after time, the moment. But something has shifted lately. The conversations happening online have taken on a different tone. The questions circulating now are no longer centered around her projects, her creative direction, or what she might do next. They've moved somewhere more personal. Somewhere that has people pausing mid-scroll, leaning slightly closer to their screens, and typing the same question into comment sections across platform after platform. What is really going on with Annie Guthrie and her husband? It started the way these things always do. A photo that lingered a little too long in people's minds. A comment that seemed to carry more weight than it should. A tone that felt subtly different from what people had come to expect. The speculation began quietly, the way a tide does, building so gradually that by the time anyone noticed how far it had come, it was already everywhere. And here is the thing that most people caught up in that speculation have missed entirely. The story behind these questions is far more layered, far more human, than anything a headline could capture. Because to understand what is happening right now, you first have to understand who Annie Guthrie actually is, where she came from, what she built, and why so many people, across so many different corners of the internet, feel genuinely, personally invested in a woman they've never met. This is not a gossip story. This is not a rise and fall arc designed to satisfy a news cycle. This is a human story, one that is still unfolding in real time, and one that deserves to be told with the same care and honesty that Annie herself has always brought to everything she does. Annie Guthrie occupies a space in the cultural conversation that is genuinely rare. She is someone who built a following not through controversy or spectacle or the kind of carefully maintained mystique that most public figures rely on, but simply through being real. Her presence in whatever format you encounter it carries a quality that resists description but is immediately felt. It's unscripted in the truest sense. And in a world where audiences have become extraordinarily skilled at detecting performance, that quality lands differently. It cuts through. People don't just follow Annie Guthrie. They root for her the way you root for someone you actually know. Which is precisely why the questions now circulating about her relationship have generated not just curiosity, but something that more closely resembles concern. This is the kind of attention that only emerges when a community has genuinely connected with someone. When they've crossed the invisible line between observing a public figure and caring about a person. And that crossing, that shift in how an audience relates to someone, is at the very heart of everything happening right now. But to understand what is happening now, you have to go back to the beginning, not the public beginning, the real one. Long before Annie Guthrie was a name that anybody recognized, she was simply a young woman with an instinct for storytelling and a way of seeing the world that set her quietly apart. People who knew her during those earlier years described someone who was never the loudest presence in a room. She was the one positioned slightly to the side of things, watching everything, absorbing the textures of moments that most people walked right past without noticing. There was a stillness to her attentiveness that felt deliberate even then, like she was storing things away for later, filing details that she somehow knew would eventually matter. That quality, that almost preternatural observational depth, would become one of the defining instruments of her later work. But in those earlier years, it was simply who she was. And the world hadn't caught up to it yet. Getting to a place where the world could catch up was not a simple or comfortable journey. Annie didn't grow up inside the industry. There were no family connections quietly opening doors. No insider access to the conversations and relationships that so often determine who gets a chance and who doesn't. What she had instead was a belief in herself that persisted even when nothing around her offered confirmation. A deep, almost stubborn certainty that she belonged in the world of storytelling, even during the stretches when that world seemed entirely indifferent to her existence. And there were long stretches like that. There were moments of genuine doubt, Stretches where the distance between where she stood and where she was trying to reach felt not just wide but bottomless. Anyone who has ever pursued something creative through years of silence and uncertainty knows the particular weight of that experience. The loneliness of working towards something with no guarantee that it will ever arrive, with no external validation to hold onto, with nothing but the internal conviction that you're moving in the right direction. Annie moved through all of that. She developed her craft the slow way, through repetition, through showing up for the work even when nobody was watching and nothing was building, through the quiet accumulation of discipline and skill and artistic instinct that doesn't photograph well and doesn't generate content, but forms the bedrock of everything that comes after. What's remarkable looking back at this period now is how completely formed she already was as a person. The warmth that would eventually connect with millions of people, the directness, the humor that always felt earned rather than performed, the vulnerability that she wore without apparent self-consciousness, all of it was already present. It just hadn't found the right stage yet, and then, almost without announcement, something shifted. An opportunity arrived that didn't look, on its surface, like the one. It didn't come wrapped in obvious significance. It looked, if anything, like a risk, like a step sideways rather than forward. But Annie leaned into it with the same quiet conviction she'd always carried. And that decision, made without any real sense of what it would set in motion, began to change the entire shape of what her life was becoming. Because that's how real turning points actually work. They almost never announce themselves. They look like ordinary choices until much later when you can finally see what they opened. Annie Guthrie stepped through that door. And the world slowly at first and then all at once began to notice. There is a specific kind of moment that happens in a creative person's life, when the work they have been building in relative quiet, finally, meets the audience that was always waiting for exactly that. Work. When years of effort stop being private and start being visible. When the accumulation suddenly crystallizes into something the rest of the world can see and feel and respond to. For Annie, that moment arrived with a quality that people who were there still describe as almost surreal. She stepped into a project, a collaboration, a creative space that placed her in front of people who had never encountered her before. And what happened next didn't require engineering or amplification. People responded to her immediately and organically in the way that only happens when something genuine is being offered. They felt with an intimacy that surprised even them, like they already knew her. That feeling, that specific sense of immediate recognition, is the rarest currency in the attention economy. You cannot manufacture it, you cannot buy it. No algorithm produces it on demand. It emerges only when the person on the other side of the screen is actually, fully there, not performing presence but inhabiting it. And Annie inhabited it in a way that cut cleanly through the noise of everything competing for the same eyeballs. Comment sections filled. Content was shared not because a campaign prompted it, but because people wanted the people they loved to experience what they were experiencing. The messages that arrived weren't transactional. They were personal, the kind that creators read more than once and remember long after the moment has passed. But here is what made this breakthrough genuinely different from so many others that flame brightly and then fade. Annie didn't allow it to reshape her. She didn't begin performing a more polished, more managed version of herself in response to the growing audience. She remained, with almost willful consistency, exactly who she had always been. And that refusal to become a product, that choice to stay rooted in the self she'd brought to the work before anyone was watching, is precisely what deepened the connection rather than diluting it. People who collaborated with her during this period speak about the experience with a warmth that doesn't sound like professional courtesy. The themes that emerge are consistent. She was present, genuinely present, in a way that can't be faked. She was generous with her attention. She cared about the quality of the work more than she cared about appearing to already have all the answers. That particular combination of talent and humility and honest curiosity is rarer than most people realize. And the people around her recognized what they were working alongside. What happened next surprised even those who were closest to her. The momentum didn't plateau, it compounded. Each new project, each new piece of work that found its audience, added another dimension to a public profile that was expanding faster than anyone had predicted. Doors that would have seemed completely closed just a short while before began opening without effort. And in the midst of all of this external movement, something quieter was developing alongside it. Something personal and private that would eventually find its way into the public conversation in ways that neither Annie nor the person she was building a life with could have anticipated. But that story wasn't ready to be told yet, because the height of what she was building, publicly and creatively, still lay ahead. When an audience builds a genuine relationship with someone over time, the success that follows has a different weight than conventional fame. It isn't constructed on spectacle or on the manufactured moments that fill entertainment news cycles. It's built on something much harder to establish and much harder to shake once it exists. It's built on trust. And what Annie Guthrie built during the peak of her public rise was exactly that. A reservoir of trust so deep and so consistent that it changed the nature of the relationship between her and her audience entirely. This is not a small distinction. We live in an era of profound celebrity skepticism. Audiences have become almost forensically attentive to the gap between what public figures project and what they actually are. That gap, once exposed, rarely closes. And so the people who manage to eliminate it, who show up in public with the same person they are in private, tend to generate a quality of loyalty that is categorically different from ordinary fandom. Annie generated that loyalty by doing something deceptively simple. She talked about real things. She let real moments exist without smoothing them into something more comfortable. She allowed herself to be imperfect in public, to not have everything resolved and curated and ready for consumption. And her audience, sensing the rarity of what they were being offered, responded with an investment that went far beyond passive appreciation. The work she pursued during this period reflected the same instinct. She was not drawn to prestige for its own sake. She was drawn to stories that carried genuine human weight, to projects that reflected the actual texture of people's inner lives rather than the polished surfaces that entertainment so often settles for. And the responses to those choices confirmed what she had always seemed to intuitively understand about where her voice fit in the world. Her reach expanded, her influence deepened. But the more significant development was happening at the level of connection rather than visibility. The people following Annie's journey weren't consuming content, they were invested in a person. They tracked the nuances of her creative choices. They noticed the details that most audiences overlook. They were attentive in the way that only happens when someone has made you feel genuinely seen, and you want to extend that same attentiveness back. That level of mutual attentiveness is extraordinary, and it is, as most extraordinary things are, a double-edged gift. When you are thriving, the support of an audience that attuned is unlike anything else. It amplifies and sustains and carries you in ways that are deeply felt. But when something shifts, when something in the narrative changes even slightly, that same audience notices. They register the shift even before they can name it, and they begin to ask questions. This is precisely the context from which the current wave of online conversation about Annie and her husband has emerged. It did not come from malice. It did not emerge from the gossip ecosystem that feeds on manufactured controversy. It came from a community that has been paying close, sustained, genuine attention, and that has sensed, with the instinct of people who actually care, that something has quietly changed. What exactly are they sensing? And what does the fuller picture actually contain? That's where the story becomes something worth sitting with, because what happened next was not a scandal. It was not a collapse. It was something far more complicated and far more honest than either of those things. It was a turning point. Every life, no matter how carefully and thoughtfully it is lived, eventually arrives at moments that resist management. Moments where the stories we've been telling about ourselves and that others have been telling about us no longer quite hold. Where we have to locate ourselves without the reassurance of a clear narrative structure holding everything in place. Annie Guthrie arrived at one of those moments. The specific details of what that chapter contains have not been made fully public. And that honesty is worth sitting with, because the absence of complete information is precisely what has given the online speculation room to grow. People are working from fragments, from glimpses and tonal shifts, and the subtle changes in presence that attentive audiences absorb without always being able to articulate what they're absorbing. What is observable is this. Something shifted in the dynamic that Annie and her husband had built in the portion of their relationship that was visible to the world. The relationship, which had been one of the warmest and most relatable aspects of Annie's public presence, began drawing a different quality of attention. The ease that had previously characterized how people talked about them began to give way to questions, to uncertainty, to a searching quality in the comment sections that replaced the uncomplicated affection that had lived there before. And this is the moment where it becomes genuinely important to hold everything carefully, because internet culture has a strong gravitational pull toward conclusions. There is enormous pressure online to take whatever fragments are available and assemble them into a narrative that feels complete, that satisfies the need for a story with a shape and a meaning, even when the actual picture remains genuinely unclear. Annie Guthrie's situation, whatever it actually contains, deserves more care than that, not because she is famous, but because she is a human being navigating something real. What the online conversation has uncovered, beneath all the speculation, is actually something more interesting and more universal than drama. It's a genuine collective grappling with what it means to live a partly public life during private moments, with what it costs to be in a relationship that an audience has formed emotional attachments to, with the strange and specific pressure of being watched and cared about by strangers during chapters that feel deeply personal. That pressure is one that very few people ever have to navigate. And the fact that Annie has continued, through whatever this chapter represents, to show up, to create, to remain present with the community she has built, speaks to something foundational in her character. Something that was there long before the audience was. But here is what the online conversation, for all its breadth and intensity, has not yet fully landed on. The questions themselves, the sheer volume of people asking them simultaneously, are themselves a kind of answer. They tell us something significant about what Annie Guthrie has built and what it means to the people who are part of it. Her story, her relationship, her life as she has chosen to partially share it, has become threaded into how a large and genuinely invested community thinks about their own experiences of love and partnership, and the vulnerability of building something real in a world that is always watching. That is not incidental. That is not a side effect of fame. That is a profound and rare form of human connection, and whatever comes next in her story will carry the full weight of that. The most truthful thing that can be said about where Annie Guthrie's story stands in this moment is also the simplest. It is not finished. And that incompleteness, far from being a frustration, is perhaps the most important thing to actually understand about where things are. We live in a culture that has very little tolerance for unresolved narratives. We want endings. We want the moment where the meaning crystallizes and the arc closes, and we know what to make of everything that came before. We want the story to tell us what it's about. But real lives resist that structure. Real lives are slower and messier, and more genuinely surprising than any narrative we could impose on them from the outside. Annie's story is behaving exactly the way real stories do. What is clear is that she has not gone quiet. She has not retreated behind the protective infrastructure that public life makes available to those who need it. She has not disappeared into careful statements or managed distance or the curated silence that so often signals that something has broken beyond repair. She is still present, still working, still creating the kind of work that first caused people to stop and pay attention. And in its quiet way, that is an answer. Perhaps not the answer that the most impatient corner of the internet is looking for, but an answer nonetheless. Because the people who are genuinely overwhelmed by scrutiny tend to go silent. The ones who have something to protect tend to pull back. The fact that Annie has continued to show up with the same quality of presence, she always speaks directly to the foundation she was building long before any of this attention arrived. That foundation holds. Her influence has not contracted during this period. If anything, the attention generated by the current conversation has carried her story to people who hadn't been paying close attention before. New conversations have opened. New communities have discovered what those who have been present from the beginning already knew. And the core audience, the people who have been rooting for her through every chapter, are showing up with the same loyalty they have always brought. As for the relationship itself, the chapter that sits at the center of so much current speculation, it remains, like Annie's larger story, something that is still being written. The people closest to the situation seem to share a consistent understanding of one thing: the public version of any relationship is always a partial version. Always. The moments that actually define a partnership, the ones that shape what two people are to each other, are almost never the moments that make it into the visible record. What persists at the end of this particular chapter in Annie Guthrie's story is something that very few people who live any portion of their life in public actually manage to protect. She has kept her humanity intact. The realness, the unguarded quality of presence that made people feel something the first time they encountered her. has not been worn down by scrutiny or consumed by the noise that has built around her. It is still there unmistakably. And if her story so far has demonstrated anything consistently, it's that this quality, this particular kind of grounded authenticity, is not just what brought her to this point. It is what will carry her through whatever this chapter becomes and into whatever comes after it. Annie Guthrie's story is not a cautionary tale. It is not a constructed arc designed to deliver a clean emotional payload. It is a genuinely human journey moving through talent and love and public life, and all the complicated, unresolvable territory that exists where those things overlap. It is the story of someone real navigating real things, in front of people who have come to genuinely care about the outcome. And that, more than any headline, more than any viral question or comment section theory, is why so many people are still watching. Because the story isn't over. And they don't want to miss what happens next. So here is what it all comes back to. Annie Guthrie didn't build what she has built through perfection. She built it through presence, through the sustained and courageous willingness to be genuinely seen in a cultural moment that rewards performance and punishes vulnerability. She chose the harder path, and the depth of what she has built is the direct result of that choice. The questions being asked about her and her husband right now, underneath the speculation and the internet noise, are something more than gossip. They are the sound of an audience that has truly invested in a person and wants to understand what the next chapter holds. They are, in their own complicated way, a form of love. Whatever that next chapter brings, whether it arrives with clarity or continues to unfold on its own quiet timeline, one thing has been demonstrated clearly enough to trust. Annie Guthrie will meet it the way she has met everything else, on her own terms, in her own voice. With the kind of resilience that doesn't generate dramatic headlines, but that builds over time something that actually lasts. So what do you think? Is the public's investment in Annie's personal life a testament to the rare connection she has built? Or has the line between genuine care and intrusion become too blurred to see clearly anymore? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of conversation worth having. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. And subscribe for more stories that go beyond the surface and into the human experience underneath. There's always more worth knowing.